Okay, so it's part 2 of lesson 2, and we're going to work a bit with our ASP.NET controllers. We looked at them a little bit last week. In a lot of ways, the controllers are the most important part of the application. Our models represent the data, our views are our user interface, our front end, but most of the logic and most of the real work in our applications happen in the controllers because they're the logic. That's where we make the decisions, and the controller is the interface between the data, the model, and our UI on the front end. So eventually, we're going to make our music store. It's going to look something like this. We'll have a home page where we have a list of albums or list of genres. We'll be able to select one and get a list of albums, and then in there, we'll be able to pick a particular product, add it to our shopping cart, and then do a checkout. So this is kind of where we're going. So for today, we'll play around with the controllers. We'll look briefly at views, but we won't do too much in the views, just pretty much basic HTML. We're going to leave the models out. We'll kind of maybe mock up some models last week. So we do have a few controllers already in our application. We played around last week by modifying the home controller, right? We had 3 pages. We had a home page or an index, we had an about, and we had a contact. And the account controller, which was built when we chose authentication, and it gave us things like register and login. So all of our controllers, they follow the same kind of naming convention. The files go in our controllers directory. All the controllers have the word controller at the end of the name, and they have a .cs extension. So here was the controller we had last week. So we're going to go ahead and make a new controller for today. I'll just close all the files I have. So to do this, I'm just going to right-click my controllers folder, choose Add, and I'll choose Controller. And when we do, Visual Studio gives us a whole bunch of options for different types of controllers we might create. Later on, we're going to be picking this option, MVC controller with views with Entity Framework. For today, we just want an empty controller. We're going to do stuff manually today because the automatic stuff isn't going to make a lot of sense unless we first know how to do it manually. So we'll build a simple controller today. So we'll pick an empty controller, click Add. Let's just call this Store Controller. We don't need to give it an extension. Visual Studio will automatically assign a .cs extension to it. You're probably looking at this morning's repository then. You're looking at the AM or the PM version? Well, the last upload, I have 2 separate repositories on GitHub. So I have not updated my afternoon class repository for a week. The current one was the one I did this morning. Yeah, so we're going to do what's already in that repository. So you could just delete the file and follow along. That's fine. I'm going to close Management Studio here. I don't really need it anymore for today. So we get this controller. So this controller means this class inherits from the MVC parent controller class. There's no inherits keyword we need. We just, in the class definition, this controller means this class inherits. This is the child, this is the parent. And notice it automatically gives us an index method. So we don't have to, if we don't want an index method, we can get rid of it. But by default, we're going to want one. So it will give us a URL path, something like this, right? The reason we have an index method is this will be the default. If we don't specify a particular method in the controller, it automatically calls the index method. It's kind of like the home page for one section of the application. So this, we're putting in /index, they're equivalent. This part kind of implied, so it's optional. We don't really need it.
The colon between the class and the inherited class something unique to C#, or is that unique just to the .NET framework?
It's unique to C#. So if we were building a desktop app where we were inheriting a class, it'd be the same thing. Yeah. So it will look for a view. So I'll save this. And now I'm going to go in my browser and we'll try and load /store. We don't need /index because that's the default method. If no method specified, it looks for an index method. So it's going to try to load, and we got a 404 error. How come? That's right. Anytime we modify the C# code, remember we need to build the file. So right now the server is still serving the old version of the DLL that doesn't contain a store controller and an index method. So if we build, that 404 error should go away once our compilation is done. So our build was successful. I can refresh again. So we didn't get a 404 error. It does actually call our index method. What's going on here? Why do we get the, as .NET developers like to call this, the yellow error screen of death? What's happened? Rick, you probably won't get this if you use my repository. What is the error message telling us? Yeah, it's trying to load a view, and here are all the places it looks. So it looks for any one of these files, and most of them is inside of views and store. It also checks inside of views and shared for any file called index in either of those paths. But there is no index file with any of those extensions either in shared or in store. So our method's being called, but the method is trying to return a view of the same name, and that view doesn't exist. So we need to create an index view. Notice inside of views, we now have a subfolder called store. We didn't create that. Visual Studio created it automatically. We build a store controller, it builds a views store subfolder. But as you can see, there's no arrow beside it, so it's blank. So we want to right click our views store and we want to add a view. What do we need to call the view? We need to call it index. The view name has to match the method name in the controller that's calling it. So we'll call it index. Our template is empty. We're not using a database model today. We'll do that in a couple of weeks. It defaults to my shared layout page in views shared layout. If this box is empty, just click the browse button and click on views shared and select your layout template. It probably defaults already, so you shouldn't have to browse and pick. So now just click add. It builds a simple view. Now we should be able to go back to the browser and refresh. We don't need to build because we didn't modify the server-side code. We've only added a new HTML file. So no compiling should be necessary. So now we refresh, and there's our view. So we're not going to do too much with the view today. We'll kind of focus on modifying views more next week. That's kind of the focus of next week's lesson, is we'll dive into this Razor syntax a bit more and look at how we build kind of more production level front ends. Let's change a few things here. Up here, instead of the title saying index, Let's change it to say store. And we'll also change the H2 tag. And just save those changes. They should show up in our browser. So up here, my title's changed and my actual visible heading on the page is changed. So let's add a list. In a few weeks, we'll modify this so that the list is actually going to come from the genres table in our database. We don't need it right now. I'll just make a simple unordered list. We won't put on all the genres. We'll just put on a few. So we have a simple unordered list. So now our page looks like this. Now we want to make each of these a link. So the user can click on any one of these and we'll take them to another page, and then eventually we'll want to display all of the albums in the category that they select. If they click rock, we'll show them rock albums. If they click blues, we'll show them blues albums. So we could do this with standard HTML links, but we want to use the server-side links, the Razor syntax we used last week. It was used here in our nav bar. On lines, you see it on lines 20 and then 24 through 27. We use this HTML action link instead. So instead of simply linking to a page, we want to call a method in a controller. So we'll sort of build these links out a piece at a time. So we'll use the @ symbol, which indicates we're writing server-side code. And we're going to use the HTML library and call the action link method. The first thing we want to do is we want our link to still say rock. That's what the user sees. We're going to call a new method, which we're going to build in our controller in a minute, which we will call details. And lastly, we need to specify which controller this method was going to live in. It's going to live in our store controller. So if we save and refresh our page, the word rock should turn blue, should look like a link, behave like a link. And when we click it, it's going to call the URL /store/details. Now we haven't handled that URL yet. We'll do that next. So here's the result we should get. Notice the text turns blue, and I can hover over that. It gets underlined, unlike my others. So we'll want to do the same thing with the other two links. Sorry, the other two genre values. We want to turn them into links. They're all going to call the same method. So let's repeat that. Our second link, the text is jazz. It also is going to call the details method in the store controller. And our third item in the list is also going to be a link. So I just repeated the same thing 3 times. Text is different on each link. Page looks like this now. So we'll leave this for now, or we will come back here. We're going to need to do a bit more with it, but these should be functional now. what happens if you click one of those links in your browser? What do you get? Well, do you get just a blank page? Right, we get a 404 because it's looking for a method called details in the controller, in the store controller. Store controller only has one method, which is index. There is no details method here. So 404 is the expected result. Notice the URL now is /store/details. That's where we want this to go. But we haven't done anything at this URL. Our page has no idea what to do, so we get a 404. Now, later on in a few weeks, we'll also look at how do we handle 404 errors. Obviously, this isn't a good approach. We'll want to do something different. We'll want to take the user to a 404 page. We don't have one of those yet, but we'll want to build one. And later on, we can use our web.config file. We can use this to handle 404 errors. Similar. Well, it's like that, except an htaccess file, all it basically does is handle like server administration. It doesn't really handle any application administration. Like you wouldn't put, say, a database connection string in an htaccess, right? This does both. So this handles both server settings as well as application settings. So we've got, versions of things, like what version of the .NET framework are we targeting? We've got our database connection, how we're handling authentication, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a lot here. So it does both, like a souped up htaccess file in effect.
Yeah, does it get called or executed every time the page is loaded, or?
It doesn't get executed. It's not actually code, so it doesn't get included in our DL. It's just an XML document, which is why we can make changes to this and save, and we don't need to recompile. Although the server will run the application again. So if I change the web.config file and upload to the server, that first request will behave as if I did compile. So it's just a configuration doc, just a text document really in XML format. And I could show you what that might look like, for example. Let's go somewhere like here.